When I saw my husband staring at the small flash drive he had found on my desk, my heart skipped a beat, but not from fear of being caught. It was the terror of him seeing what was on it. Those files. The ones I hadn't meant for anyone to see, the ones I'd carelessly forgotten to hide. I reached for it, too quickly, too obviously, and his hand pulled back, his fingers gripping the metal like it held the truth of our entire marriage. I watched his face change, shadows of confusion crossing into suspicion as he turned the object over in his hand, as if trying to guess its weight, its meaning. His eyes met mine, steady and searching, and for a second I wanted to confess everything, to shatter the silence before it consumed me. But then his thumb hovered over the laptop's port, and I froze. His hand trembled slightly as he slid the drive in, and I knew, any moment now, he would see the files that would ruin me. Not all of the truth, not even the worst of it, but enough. Enough to tear apart the life we'd built over decades. The screen blinked to life, the folder opening, and my breath caught when the first thumbnail appeared. His breathing grew heavier, each exhale sharp, ragged, almost louder than the rain outside. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, my teeth sinking into the inside of my cheek, an old habit when panic rose in me like a wave. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake, one that changed absolutely everything. And now, as he stared at the files in silence, I knew there was no undoing it. But before I tell you what he saw, before I share the secret I worked so hard to bury, let me tell you how it all began. The truth is, nothing in my life screamed of disaster 3 months ago. My marriage wasn't a tragedy, not a battlefield of broken plates and shouting matches. It was quiet. Almost too quiet. My husband had his work, endless phone calls, meetings, trips, and I had the house, which felt more like a museum than a home these days. We didn't fight, we didn't shout, but sometimes silence is worse. It seeps into the walls and into your skin until you start to wonder if anyone really sees you at all. I remember standing in front of the hallway mirror one morning, staring at my own reflection longer than I meant to. Noticing the soft lines that hadn't been there 10 years ago, the way my eyes seemed dimmer. I pressed my fingers to the glass, as if touching that woman's face could somehow bring back the one I used to be. It wasn't that I thought I was unattractive. It was the feeling of being unseen, like I'd become part of the furniture in my own life. That same week, the doorbell rang, and he returned. My husband's son from his first marriage, the one who'd been away at art school, now with stacks of sketchbooks and canvases and the smell of turpentine trailing after him. He brought with him something the house hadn't felt in years: movement, noise, the sound of someone setting up an easel in the corner room and talking about colors like they were living things. He hugged me when he arrived. Just a normal embrace, the kind you give someone who has been in your life for years but also somehow isn't. But there was an awkwardness in the way he pulled back, like he was seeing me properly for the first time. His eyes lingered a second too long, not inappropriately, not yet, just studying. The way an artist studies light and shadow. That evening, we sat at the dinner table, my husband on his phone as usual, muttering about some late meeting. I asked about his classes, his projects, trying to fill the air. He smiled, a little shy, then said it, "You know, you'd make a great muse." The word hung in the room like smoke. Muse. I laughed nervously, made some joke about being too old for that kind of thing, but I felt the syllables stay in me, heavy and unshakable. The next day, he asked again, this time more seriously. He needed portraits, he said, for his portfolio. He wanted real people, not models. And for some reason, maybe boredom, maybe curiosity, maybe that ache I couldn't name, I agreed. The first session was awkward. I sat in an armchair he'd dragged into the studio, my hands folded in my lap, and tried to stay still. He adjusted the light, muttered about angles, scribbled quick lines on paper. Every now and then, he'd step closer to tilt my chin or move my hand just slightly. His fingertips barely touched my wrist, my shoulder, but every touch felt louder than it should have. I told myself it was nothing. This was art. This was helping him. And yet, sitting there, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, not attraction, not exactly, but awareness. Of my own body. Of the way someone was looking at me with complete attention, seeing every crease, every line, every shade of me. Later that night, after he'd gone to his room and my husband had fallen asleep on the couch with the TV murmuring in the background, I lingered in front of the bathroom mirror again. I touched my face, my collarbone, trying to see what he'd seen. I found myself straightening my posture, running my fingers through my hair, not for my husband, but for the memory of that focused gaze. Over the next days, I kept telling myself this was harmless. Sitting for portraits wasn't a betrayal. It wasn't even unusual. But there was something shifting, almost imperceptibly, like the earth moving under my feet. He'd bring tea into the studio and leave the mug by my chair. He'd hum while he worked, the sound soft, unassuming, but it filled the silence. And every time he'd ask me to hold that pose, or turn just slightly, I felt the world narrow to that moment, the line of his pencil, the way his breath slowed when he concentrated. One afternoon, I noticed something small but undeniable. He'd drawn me not just as I was sitting there, but as he saw me, softer, somehow, lighter. It wasn't about flattery, it was about seeing. He saw me in a way my husband hadn't in years. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the rain, listening to my husband snore lightly beside me, and I wondered why it mattered so much to be seen. Why I was thinking about it at all. Because this was the start. Not of something physical, not yet. But of something even more dangerous, the beginning of a feeling I didn't want to name. The next morning, the sun filtered through the sheer curtains, casting long, soft shadows across the living room where the easel stood. I found myself drawn to it, even before the house stirred awake. The scent of turpentine and oil paint still lingered faintly in the air, a reminder of last night's session. The studio, tucked away in the corner room, felt different now, less like a simple workspace and more like a place charged with an energy I couldn't quite explain. As I walked toward the chair where I had posed, I felt an unfamiliar flutter deep in my chest. It wasn't fear or guilt, it was something else, anticipation, perhaps, or the fragile hope of being seen. I touched the fabric draped over the back of the chair, rough and paint-splattered, and tried to steady my breath. He appeared from the hallway, carrying a cup of coffee, his eyes lighting up when they met mine. The casual way he offered me the cup was loaded with unspoken meaning. There was a gentleness to his presence that made me feel lighter, as if the weight of years spent in silence was momentarily lifted. The session began with the usual instructions: sit still, hold your gaze here, relax your hands. But as the minutes passed, the air between us thickened with something beyond paint and canvas. His focus was intense, not just on the lines and shapes, but on me, every subtle movement, every involuntary twitch of emotion. I became aware of how my own hands rested, how my shoulders curved and tensed without my control. He moved closer to adjust a stray lock of hair falling over my forehead, his fingers brushing my skin with a tenderness that sent a jolt through me. The contact was brief, yet it resonated in a way I hadn't felt in years. I swallowed hard, eyes fixed on a point beyond the window, willing myself to stay composed. But the quiet intimacy of the room, the soft hum of his pencil on paper, and the way he looked at me as though I were both fragile and fierce at once made me realize that the walls I'd built around myself were beginning to crumble. His voice, when he spoke, was low and measured, yet carried a weight I hadn't anticipated. "You're more alive than you think," he said quietly. The words settled in my mind like an echo, awakening memories and feelings I'd tucked away. I found myself relaxing into the chair, breathing more deeply, surrendering to the moment. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't just existing, I was present. Not as a wife, or a mother, or a caretaker, but simply as myself. Complex, imperfect, and utterly human. The session stretched on, time losing meaning. Shadows shifted with the changing light, and I sensed his gaze tracing the contours of my face, as if trying to capture something elusive. When he finally set down his brush, his eyes held mine with an intensity that both unsettled and comforted me. We shared a quiet smile, a simple exchange, but laden with significance. It was as if, in that moment, an unspoken understanding had passed between us. He saw me, truly saw me, in a way that my husband hadn't in years. Later, as I left the studio and stepped back into the quiet house, the contrast was stark. The empty rooms echoed with silence, and I felt the familiar ache of invisibility creeping back. Yet beneath that ache, a small flame flickered, fragile, uncertain, but undeniable. I wondered how long I could carry this secret with me, this new sense of self kindled by his attentive eyes and gentle touch. How long before it changed everything? I didn't have the answers, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready to find out. The following days blended into a strange rhythm, one that felt both familiar and entirely new. Each morning, I would pass by the studio, telling myself I was simply checking if the light had shifted in the corner window or if he needed more tea. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the light I was curious about, it was him. His presence in the house had become an invisible current, something I could feel even from another room, subtle yet insistent. My husband's routine remained unchanged. Early mornings filled with muted phone calls, evenings lost to paperwork and television that barely held his attention. He spoke to me, of course, about errands, about bills, about the dry cleaning, but never about me. It was a polite, quiet partnership, but one that left me feeling like a background figure in my own life. The studio, though, was different. The studio breathed. Every time I stepped inside, I felt the shift, like entering a different kind of air, thicker, warmer, charged with something I couldn't fully name. He would already be there, sleeves rolled up, the faint streak of paint on his forearm, his hair falling into his eyes as he set up the canvas. It was easy to forget the roles we all played outside that room. During the third session, he asked me to sit in a different position, angled toward the window so the sunlight would frame my face. The instructions were simple enough, but I became acutely aware of the way my dress tugged at my knees, how my hand rested on the arm of the chair. I felt as if every inch of me was under a microscope, and yet it wasn't uncomfortable. It was awakening. He worked in silence for a long time, the scratch of pencil on paper filling the room like a soft pulse. Every so often, he would step closer, leaning in just enough to adjust my posture. His hand brushed lightly against my shoulder as he repositioned it, and though the touch lasted only a moment, my breath caught in my throat. I told myself to stay still, to keep my face neutral, but I could feel the warmth creeping up my neck. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, that his closeness was purely practical, that my reaction was simply the product of too much time alone in a quiet marriage. But there was something undeniable in the way he looked at me. It wasn't the casual glance of someone seeing you by chance, it was the studied gaze of someone memorizing every detail. When he paused to change brushes, I caught sight of the sketch he'd been working on. It was me, of course, but not quite as I'd seen myself in the mirror that morning. The lines were softer, the light kinder. There was an intimacy in the drawing that startled me. It wasn't just a portrait, it was a version of me through his eyes. That night, I found myself thinking about that sketch long after I'd gone to bed. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the steady breathing of my husband next to me. I stared at the ceiling and wondered when exactly I had stopped feeling like someone worth being drawn at all. The next afternoon, he asked me to hold my hand in a certain way, stretched slightly outward, as though reaching for something unseen. I tried to mimic what he described, but my fingers trembled faintly, betraying the stillness I wanted to project. He noticed, of course, he noticed everything. "You don't have to be perfect," he said quietly, not looking up from the canvas. Sometimes it's the small flaws that make something real. The words stayed with me longer than I expected. They felt heavier than casual encouragement, like they were meant for more than just the way I held my hand. By the end of the week, the routine had solidified. He would set up in the studio, I would step in with the intention of helping, of posing just for a few minutes, and the hours would slip away unnoticed. Each session left me feeling both lighter and more unsettled, as if the act of sitting for him was peeling away layers I hadn't realized I'd built up over the years. One evening, after a particularly long session, I lingered in front of the sketch he had left on the easel. He had stepped out to wash his brushes, and I was alone with the image. My face stared back at me from the paper, but it wasn't the tired reflection I'd seen in the mirror for months, it was someone else. Someone softer. Someone seen. I stood there for a long time, longer than I should have, before stepping out into the hallway. The smell of paint clung to me like an invisible thread, and as I walked past my husband, who barely glanced up from his phone, I felt the tension between two worlds tightening. In bed that night, I lay awake again, turning over every word, every look, every breath held too long. This had started as something innocent. It still was, on the surface. But beneath it, something was shifting, and I didn't know if I wanted to stop it. The next week blurred into something that felt almost dreamlike, though there was nothing supernatural about it, only the subtle way my life had started tilting, degree by degree, in a new direction. It wasn't that the house itself had changed, the walls were still the same pale color, the same pictures hung where they'd always been. It was me. I was the one who felt different in every room I entered, as if each space held the shadow of the studio in its corners. My husband remained steady in his routines, his days marked by work calls and half-eaten dinners, his conversations skimming only the surface of things. He would ask if I needed anything from the store, or if I'd paid a bill, but he never asked about me. I noticed, not for the first time, how little eye contact we made anymore. Our marriage wasn't hostile, it wasn't cold, it was just muted. And somewhere in that mutedness, I had faded. The studio had become the opposite of that. Each time I stepped inside, it was as if someone had turned up the volume on life. He'd be there, sometimes already working when I arrived, the faint scratch of pencil on paper filling the quiet. The smell of linseed oil, the scattered brushes on the table, the late afternoon light pooling across the floor, it all created an atmosphere that felt alive in a way the rest of the house didn't. On a rainy afternoon, he asked me if I'd come with him to the gallery in town. He said he needed to look at a few pieces for inspiration, but I could tell from the way he phrased it that this wasn't just an errand. I hesitated at first, but something in me craved the disruption of routine. The gallery was small, tucked between a bookstore and a cafe, and the air inside smelled faintly of dust and varnish. We moved slowly through the rooms, pausing in front of canvases that carried more questions than answers. He spoke softly about the brushstrokes, about the use of light, but there were moments when his voice trailed off and we just stood there, side by side, looking without speaking. Afterward, we ducked into the cafe across the street, a tiny place with mismatched chairs and chipped mugs. The rain streaked the windows, blurring the city outside, making the table between us feel like its own private island. He pulled a napkin toward him and, almost without thinking, began sketching. I watched his hand move quickly, the lines forming something recognizable almost instantly. Me. Even in that rough sketch, even in the crooked lines of a cafe napkin, he caught something I couldn't name. Something I wasn't sure anyone else could see. I found myself leaning closer, not to look at the drawing but at him, at the concentration in his brow, the way his fingers smudged the pencil marks as he worked. And when he looked up and caught my gaze, something in the air shifted, not sharply, but undeniably. We didn't speak of it. Neither of us needed to. The weight of that moment followed us back to the car, back to the house, settling over me like an invisible shawl. That evening, my husband came home late, muttering about a delayed meeting. He kissed my cheek absently and went straight to his desk, leaving his dinner untouched. I sat at the table longer than necessary, the silence pressing in on me, and thought about that napkin sketch sitting in my bag. The next morning, the studio felt even smaller, even closer, as if the walls themselves had leaned in. He asked me to tilt my chin, to lower my shoulder, to look slightly past him toward the window. His directions were soft, almost hesitant, and every so often, his fingers brushed against me to adjust something. Each touch was light, brief, and entirely appropriate. And yet my body betrayed me. I felt every fingertip, every graze of his hand, like sparks across my skin. I wondered if he noticed. I wondered if he felt it too, or if I was alone in this quiet, building storm. By the end of that session, my pulse was steadying, but the awareness lingered. I walked out of the studio and into the hallway, the shift between those two worlds jarring. My husband's voice carried from the kitchen, casual and distant as he asked if we needed milk. The contrast nearly made me dizzy. That night, I sat in the living room long after everyone had gone to bed, the sound of rain still tapping against the windows. I held the napkin from the cafe, now creased from being folded too many times, and stared at the lines that made up my face. It wasn't that the sketch made me look beautiful, it was that it made me look alive. And as I sat there, the house dark and still around me, I realized how dangerous that feeling was becoming. Not because of what had happened, but because of what hadn't, and what I wasn't sure I wanted to stop. The days had begun to carry a new weight, one that I felt in the quiet moments, when I stood at the sink washing dishes or passed the framed wedding photo in the hallway. There was a heaviness to ordinary things now, a constant hum beneath my thoughts, as if my own life had grown too layered to easily understand. The studio sessions had changed subtly, almost imperceptibly, yet enough that I felt the shift in every breath. It wasn't the way he held the brush, or the pencil lines scattered across his sketchbook, it was how his eyes lingered a little longer, how my own body seemed to anticipate his presence even before he stepped into the room. That morning, the air in the house was still. My husband had left early for a meeting, the front door had clicked shut before dawn. The absence of his footsteps, his voice, his cluttered energy created a silence that felt both freeing and guilty at once. I walked toward the studio, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor, my heartbeat too loud in my chest. He was already there, arranging brushes, the faint streak of color on his knuckle making him look like he had been creating all night. He looked up when I entered, and there was that same pause, that same shift in his expression, as if words had become unnecessary. He asked me to sit, his voice quiet, almost cautious, and I lowered myself into the chair we had now made into something sacred by repetition. The light fell differently that day, it was softer, filtered through the clouds, painting my skin in muted tones. The session began as they always did, simple directions, long stretches of silence, the sound of a pencil scratching faintly against paper. But it wasn't just stillness between us, it was awareness. Each time he adjusted my pose, a light touch on my elbow or a guiding hand on my wrist, the room seemed to grow smaller, the air thicker. I tried to focus on the lines of the window frame, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the other room, anything to keep my thoughts from spiraling. But his nearness kept drawing me back, pulling me into a space I hadn't meant to enter. At one point, he set his brush down and simply looked at me. Not the quick, darting glance of someone checking their work, but the steady gaze of someone memorizing what they see. My breath faltered, and I hated that he could hear it, that my chest betrayed every unspoken thought. And then, it happened. No words. No long build-up. Just a moment too long of silence, a glance that didn't move away, and then, we kissed, The simplest words in the world, and yet they carried the weight of everything. It was brief, almost tentative, and then it was over. But it wasn't over. Because even after I stepped back, even after I left the studio and walked through the quiet hallways, the echo of that kiss clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I went into the kitchen and poured myself water, though my hands were trembling so much the glass nearly slipped. My reflection in the window startled me. I looked the same, but I didn't feel the same. Something had shifted, an invisible line crossed so quietly I hadn't even heard the sound of it breaking. When my husband called that afternoon to say he'd be staying late, his voice was casual, distant. I answered in the same tone I always did, the practiced calm of a wife who had learned to keep conversations smooth. But as I hung up the phone, I couldn't help the guilt that spread through me, not sharp and sudden, but slow and suffocating. That evening, I stood in the bathroom brushing my hair, staring into the mirror with a focus I hadn't had in years. I searched my face for something, some sign, some mark, that would tell me what I had become. The kiss replayed in my mind again and again, not in detail, but in feeling, the warmth, the closeness, the way it had made me remember what it was like to be wanted, to be fully present in a moment instead of simply passing through it. And though I hated myself for it, there was a part of me that didn't regret it. That truth sat heavily in my chest as the night deepened, as the house went quiet again. I lay in bed beside my husband when he finally came home, listening to his steady breathing, the soft rustle of the sheets as he turned away from me. And I thought about the kiss, and how a single, fleeting moment could change the shape of everything. The morning after the kiss felt strangely ordinary, and that, more than anything, unnerved me. I woke to the sound of birds outside the window, the faint hum of the heating system, the same creak of the floorboards when I stepped out of bed. Everything looked the same, but it wasn't. There was a subtle difference in the way I moved through the house, as if I were wearing a secret under my skin. My husband sat at the table with his coffee, scrolling absently through emails on his phone. He looked up only briefly to ask if there was milk left in the fridge. I answered with the same calm tone I always used, but my heart was pounding harder than it should have for such an ordinary exchange. It wasn't what he said, it was what he didn't say. He didn't look closely, didn't notice the way my hands trembled slightly when I poured myself tea. When he left for the office, the silence that followed was louder than usual. I stood in the kitchen long after the sound of his car faded down the street, feeling that heavy stillness settle over the house. And then I felt it, the pull. The almost physical urge to walk toward the studio. He was there already when I entered, the window open just enough to let in the cool morning air. The smell of paint was faint but familiar, mingling with the sharp scent of fresh coffee. He greeted me with a nod, his voice quiet, measured. Neither of us mentioned what had happened the day before. But the absence of words didn't erase it, if anything, it made the moment heavier. The silence wasn't awkward, it was thick, like something we were both holding but refusing to name. He set up his brushes with slow, deliberate movements, as if giving me time to leave, to walk out before the weight of what we'd done could grow any heavier. I didn't leave. The session began with small, almost meaningless instructions: tilt your head slightly, look toward the window. But even those words felt loaded now. Every time he stepped closer to adjust my hand or shift my shoulder, the air seemed to thicken. His fingers brushed my wrist, barely touching, but my pulse jumped all the same. I wanted to tell myself that it was nothing, that this was just art, that the kiss had been a fleeting mistake, nothing more. But every glance, every pause, every breath that felt too loud reminded me that the line had been crossed, and neither of us could quite step back over it. He painted in silence, his eyes darting between me and the canvas, each stroke deliberate. I couldn't see what he was creating, but I could feel it. The way he looked at me, it was as though he was trying to capture not just the shape of my face, but the unspoken things beneath it. As the light shifted in the room, he changed the angle of the lamp, moving closer each time. Our shoulders brushed once, and neither of us pulled away. That small contact lingered longer than it should have, leaving a trace of warmth on my skin. I stayed longer than planned. When I finally stood to leave, my legs felt unsteady, like I'd been sitting in one position for too long, but the truth was, it was the tension that made me shaky. I walked down the hallway, the sounds of the house suddenly too sharp, the ticking of the clock, the creak of the stairs, as though everything was alert to the shift happening between us. That evening, my husband announced over dinner that he'd be away for a few days on a business trip. He spoke casually, like it was routine, and it was. But the words landed in me with an unexpected weight. Because I knew what his absence would mean. After he packed that night, after he kissed my cheek and reminded me where he'd left the emergency numbers, I stood at the window and watched his taillights disappear down the street. The silence that followed wasn't just the quiet of an empty house, it was the quiet of something waiting to happen. I turned off the lights one by one, moving slowly through each room, and when I finally reached the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. The memory of the kiss lingered, but now it felt like something more than a single moment. It felt like the beginning of something I didn't know how to stop. I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of my own thoughts pressing down. It wasn't just guilt, though that was there too. It was anticipation. And it scared me how much I felt it. The night my husband left, the house felt different, as though his absence had shifted its very structure. It wasn't that he brought noise or clutter, if anything, he was a quiet presence, but his being there had always created a boundary, an invisible wall between thoughts and actions. Without him, the air felt weightless and dangerous all at once. I woke the next morning to an eerie kind of stillness. The kitchen clock ticked too loudly, every sound carried too far. I made coffee, though I barely tasted it. I lingered over the mug at the kitchen counter, my fingers wrapped tight around the ceramic, as if holding it could ground me in some sort of normalcy. But I already knew what would happen. It wasn't planned, not in the strictest sense. There was no whispered arrangement, no agreement. But the knowledge of it hung between us from the moment I walked into the studio that day. He was already there, the window cracked open just slightly, the morning air moving through the curtains. He didn't say much, and neither did I. The silence wasn't awkward, it was heavy, filled with the weight of what neither of us dared to voice. The session began like all the others. I sat in the chair, he arranged the brushes, the light shifted slowly as the hours passed. But there was an intensity now, a current under the surface that neither of us could ignore. His movements were slower, deliberate. My breathing was unsteady, even though I tried to control it. He asked me to turn slightly, to rest my hand on the arm of the chair. His fingers brushed against mine as he adjusted it, and that simple touch felt louder than words. He stepped back, but the space between us felt charged. I thought about leaving. There was a moment, fleeting, where I could have stood, made an excuse, walked out of the room and shut the door behind me. But I didn't. And then, there was no going back. There are some moments in life that can't be undone, moments that carve a line between before and after. That day became one of them. The house was silent, the air outside still, and by the time the sun began to dip behind the trees, the line had been crossed. We spent the night together. The words look simple on paper, almost flat, but they don't capture what it felt like in the silence afterward. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on me like an invisible hand. I sat on the edge of the bed much later, staring at the floor, my hair falling around my face, my hands clasped together so tightly my knuckles ached. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the occasional creak of the old house settling. My chest felt heavy. Not with regret, not entirely, but with the realization that something fundamental had changed. The boundary I had always thought was unbreakable was now shattered. I tried to imagine what I would say to my husband if he were here, if he asked, if he somehow knew. But my mind couldn't form the words, they dissolved before they could even reach my lips. When I finally moved from that spot, the sun was already rising. The pale morning light seeped through the blinds, casting long stripes across the floor. I stood and walked slowly through the house, my bare feet making almost no sound, but inside, my thoughts were deafening. There would be no pretending this hadn't happened. No erasing it, no folding it neatly away into the past. Because no matter how still the house seemed, nothing about it, or me, would ever be the same again. The morning after felt surreal, as though the house itself was unsure what had happened within its walls. The air seemed too still, the light too sharp, as if everything was trying to expose what I wanted to keep hidden. I walked through the kitchen in my robe, the cold tile against my feet jolting me into a reality I wasn't ready to face. The house wasn't empty anymore. My husband had come home earlier than planned. I hadn't known he'd changed his schedule until I heard the front door open, the sound of his keys hitting the table, and his voice calling out in a flat, casual tone that shouldn't have made my heart drop the way it did. He was polite, as always. His words were careful, his questions about dinner and mail ordinary enough to be harmless, but I could feel the difference in him even if I couldn't name it yet. There was a quietness to him that wasn't his usual calm, a silence that didn't feel like peace. I tried to steady myself, to fall back into the rhythms of normal life, setting plates on the table, asking about his meetings, answering his questions about errands. But there was no comfort in routine anymore. Everything I did felt like an act, a performance I wasn't sure I could sustain. He didn't ask about the studio. He didn't ask about how I'd spent my days while he was gone. His restraint was almost worse than if he'd demanded answers. He watched me from across the table with a kind of measured stillness, as though waiting for me to volunteer something he suspected. Later, when I walked past the studio door, I noticed how quiet it felt. The easel was still in the corner, the brushes resting in jars, but the room carried a different weight now. He hadn't been in there since the morning, and I hadn't either. That evening, as I cleared the table, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, expecting a casual question about leftovers, but instead, my husband held up a small object between his fingers. A flash drive. "Is this yours?" he asked simply, his tone even, almost soft. The question felt heavier than it should have, as if the little piece of plastic carried the weight of everything. I froze for a second too long before I answered, and I saw it, the subtle narrowing of his eyes, the shift in his expression that told me he noticed. I took the drive from his hand, forcing a steady breath, forcing my voice to sound calm when I said I wasn't sure where it had come from. But my fingers curled too tightly around it, and I knew he saw that too. The rest of the evening passed in a strange haze. He said little, but his silence wasn't empty, it was loaded, like the pause before thunder. I sat on the couch long after he went into his office, the flash drive resting on my lap, my thumb pressing against its edges as if I could erase its existence by touch alone. The guilt felt like a second skin, but beneath it there was another layer, fear. Not the fear of discovery, though that was there, but the fear of what I'd already done, what couldn't be undone. The walls of the house felt closer than ever. Every step I took echoed, every creak in the floorboards made me turn my head too quickly. I tried to sleep, but the night stretched long and thin, my thoughts looping endlessly, the flash drive still hidden in the drawer of the bedside table, its presence louder than any noise could ever be. By morning, I knew nothing would ever feel simple again. The morning light felt harsh, as though the sun itself had turned into an interrogator. I woke before my husband, lying still and listening to the quiet, waiting for some shift in sound or breath to tell me what he was thinking. None came. His breathing was steady, untroubled, or maybe practiced to seem that way. I slipped out of bed, trying not to disturb him, but I could feel his eyes on my back even when they weren't. In the kitchen, the flash drive sat on the counter, where I had left it the night before. Its presence filled the room, louder than the coffee maker sputtering to life, louder than the hum of the refrigerator. I stared at it for too long, my fingers twitching with the urge to grab it and hide it, to make it disappear. But I didn't. I couldn't. When my husband walked in, his face was unreadable, a mask I couldn't crack. He poured himself coffee and sat at the table, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. For several long minutes, we didn't speak. I felt each second pass like a bead sliding off a string, one after another, heavy and inevitable. Then, without warning, he reached for the flash drive and held it up between us. "What's on it?" he asked. The question was so simple, spoken in such an even tone, but it landed in my chest like a stone. My throat tightened, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I could have lied. I could have said I didn't know, that it was nothing, that it belonged to someone else. But the words stuck in my mouth. "I don't know," I finally said, the lie sounding thin even to me. He looked at me for a long moment, and the silence between us felt sharper than any raised voice could have been. Then he set the flash drive down on the table, gently, almost carefully, as though it were fragile. That gesture scared me more than anger would have. The rest of the day moved like a slow march. We went about our routines, but every movement, every word, every shared glance had attention to it, like a taut string ready to snap. I avoided the studio. I avoided his gaze. But avoiding my own thoughts was impossible. They circled endlessly, memories looping back on themselves, fragments of conversations, the feel of a hand on mine, the weight of choices I had made. That evening, I found myself standing in front of the studio door. I hadn't planned to. My feet had just carried me there, as if drawn by the gravity of everything that had happened inside. The easel was still in its place, the brushes untouched, the faint smell of paint lingering like a memory. I stood there for a long time, staring at the chair where I had sat so many times, where all of this had begun. My husband walked past the doorway and stopped. I didn't turn to look at him, but I could feel his presence behind me, heavy and unspoken. Neither of us said anything. When he finally moved on, his footsteps receding down the hall, I stayed where I was, the stillness of the room pressing in. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, every creak in the floorboards a reminder of all the things we weren't saying. I stared at the ceiling, my heart pounding, my breath shallow, the flash drive burning in my thoughts like a brand. Because I knew what it held. And I knew that once it was opened, there would be no going back. The flash drive sat in the center of the kitchen table the next morning like a piece of evidence, even though no one had called it that aloud. It wasn't hidden anymore. It wasn't tucked into a drawer or slid beneath papers, it was there, visible, as if daring someone to confront it. I moved around it carefully while making coffee, as though even brushing it with my hand would shatter whatever fragile balance still held in place. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that didn't feel like calm but like something waiting to break. My husband entered the kitchen slowly, his footsteps measured, his face unreadable. He didn't reach for the drive, not at first. He poured himself coffee, added a single spoonful of sugar, stirred with the same calm precision he used for everything in his life. And then he sat down and pulled the drive toward him. I stood frozen, the mug warm in my hands but my fingers numb. I didn't stop him. I didn't even try. He slid it into the side of the laptop, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the soft hum of the machine waking up. I wanted to look away, but my eyes stayed fixed on his face, searching for every shift, every flicker of expression. When the folder opened, I saw his jaw tighten, not a dramatic reaction, not an outburst, but a slight clench, enough to tell me that he was seeing what I had hoped he wouldn't. He didn't speak. He didn't accuse. He didn't ask for explanations. His silence was heavier than words could have been, and in that silence, the reality of what I'd done grew louder than anything else. I stood there, clutching the coffee mug, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I opened my mouth once, trying to speak, but the words dissolved before they reached the air. Finally, he closed the laptop. He didn't look at me right away. He placed the flash drive back on the table, his movements careful, deliberate. Then he stood, his chair scraping softly against the floor, and walked out of the room. He didn't slam the door. He didn't raise his voice. But his footsteps down the hallway felt like the sound of something ending. I stayed there, staring at the flash drive as if it could tell me what would happen next. The mug cooled in my hands, untouched. The rest of the day moved in fragments. I wandered through the house like a stranger, every familiar object now carrying the weight of what he'd seen. The photographs on the wall, the neatly folded towels in the bathroom, the dent in the sofa cushion where he always sat, all of it felt different, as if my choices had altered the air itself. He didn't speak to me that day, not really. There were a few quiet words about dinner, about the phone ringing, about small things that had nothing to do with anything important. But the silence between those words was what I felt most. By evening, I found myself back in the studio. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to see it one more time, to face the place where everything had begun. The chair was still in its corner, the brushes still in jars, the last unfinished canvas on the easel. I stood there for a long time, staring at the sketch of my face that he had left behind. It was unfinished, the lines trailing off at the edges, but in it, I could still see what had drawn me in from the start, the feeling of being seen, of being noticed. And yet now, looking at it, I felt something else, the sharp ache of knowing that being seen came with a cost. That night, the house was quiet again. My husband stayed in his office with the door closed, and I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sound of him moving papers, the faint creak of the chair he sat in. There was no confrontation, no explosion, no clear ending. Only the silence. And in that silence, I understood something I hadn't before, that sometimes the hardest endings aren't the ones marked by shouting or slammed doors. They're the ones marked by nothing at all. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if this would break us completely, or if we would somehow find a way to live in the wreckage. All I knew was that nothing about my life, my marriage, or myself would ever go back to what it was. And maybe, in some way I couldn't admit yet, I wasn't sure if I even wanted it to.